Hello guys, this is Axter from Players Council speaking. Today we are going to take a look at the shadow strategies and some general tips for them. I would like to point out that you can definitely use this database as well, the Lord of the Rings trading card game Wikipedia basically. I believe it is run by the same people who look after GAMP, and you can definitely see the images in various designs that were printed out throughout the golden era of this game. So something to keep in mind for the starters. Now let's get to the shadow strategies. So the main point is that before anything else, when you start deck building, you need to decide what your shadow strategy is going to be, and more importantly, what the whole deck is going to look like. We have discussed the types of decks, that means the shadow all-in strategy, the free peoples oriented build, and the balanced build. And then you need to choose the shadow accordingly, because if you pair up wrong or unfitting free peoples with shadow, then it is going to be a horrible time for you playing the deck. It will just not make sense, and you might get a win or two on your way, but it will definitely make your life unnecessarily more complicated. So, what is the role of shadow? Well, the role of shadow is either to kill the fellowship or to stop your opponent so that you can win with your free peoples. Now, how to achieve that? To stop the opponent is fairly easy. What you need to do is to try to either keep some minions on board so that your opponent has a harder time moving, because then he will get even more minions and he might just die. Or you can save the minions in your hand. If your opponent has a way to get rid of them on the first side, he moves to that turn, and then you can just play them all when he makes the double move. Those are two general ways how to play against your opponents. We are going to take a look at the first archetype, which is the stop deck. Corsairs are a perfect example of that, because what they do is that they put their ships on board when the opponent makes a double move. Then usually there are already 2 or 3 minions which you were able to play from your hand, and then you have a couple more ships to make the attack even more powerful. So that way you always create a threat on board, that if your opponent makes a move, you are able to punish it, which is a great pair for free peoples which tries to run as fast as possible to the 9th side, such as Alliance on movie block by Decipher, and therefore you have a very nice functional deck that has a clear strategy. It's very satisfying to play. Also, both sides quite thematic, so I can definitely recommend that. Now, that was the first thing, to stop your opponent. You can do that with other types of decks as well, such as wounds, which we are going to take a look at now. So, when you play a deck that tries to kill your opponent by wounds, that means either by archery, wounds, by the minion archer total, or just exerting the companions by abilities which, for example, the Suttons have. You can see an example here on Desert Lord. Or you can just put wounds on board by cards as hate, which wounds a companion in maneuver phase. And generally some damage +1 keywords help you as well, so that is the way how you want to defeat your opponent. Your greatest enemy is of course healing, so if you know that in the meta, that means in the pool of decks which are played in the format you are interested in that specific time, then you need to consider what people like to play in that time of the year, let's say. And if everybody plays 4 times Have Patience, then probably a wounds deck is not going to be very efficient for you. That is something to keep in mind. Still, it is very good to pair up the wounds deck with some free peoples that tries to run, because The sole purpose of the deck, of the Shadow I mean, is not to stop your opponent, but if he is forced to run across the 3rd or 6th side, that means he would not heal 5 wounds from his companions, then that supports your Shadow strategy even if your opponent plays a deck which is normally very difficult for you to beat. So the pair again is very important. Now, how to play such a deck? You usually need to just focus on that one thing. That means you want to put as many wounds on board as possible, but it is good to have some backup strategy in case the draw is bad, or maybe your opponent plays a lot of cards early and then chokes for the rest of the game. That means he does not pay much Twilight for you to put wounds on board. So here in this deck, what we can see is the setup combination of Haradrim Marksman, who prevents ring-bound companions from taking wounds on the side he is played, and that is very difficult to deal with from the perspective of the Free Peoples player if he tries to keep up with your Free Peoples. Let's say that on side 4 you play Desert Lord with Seasoned Leader, you exhaust Gandalf, and there is, for example, Treebeard, one more Ent, and Radagast. So you win some skirmish against potentially some smaller Haradrim. Desert Lord puts 1 wound on Treebeard, and you are forced to move again. And what happens? Let's say that your opponent plays War Towers, he's got this guy, and 1 more this guy, and this guy, and Seasoned Leader. Of course, that all is added up by the threats on board. He removes those, and then your companions start dying because you just didn't have enough time to heal your fellowship. And the second alternative here, how to punish your opponent and when the draw is bad, is to play Sauron, especially against Saved from the Fire decks. It could be game over very soon if you manage to hit your opponent to punish his Saved from the Fire early. Let's say that he burns Forest Guardian, he takes Treebeard, Linden Root and Skimbark into his hand, plays them all, and you play Sauron. Unless he has a way to deal with him, that means ideally staff, then 2 companions are going to die, and that is devastating for the deck. So something like that might often be very beneficial. Another thing that we are going to take a look at is the Overwhelm deck. It might come as a surprise for a lot of people that the Overwhelm deck here are the Besiegers. They seem generally good, but a lot of people might argue that they often win by wounds. That is also possible, but that is caused by the fact that the cards in this deck, that is, the cards in the format which you are able to play, are just generally good in terms of value. They are able to win skirmishes, often they have fears, and they can wound companions which are not able to protect themselves. So that way the deck can also win by wounds, but it is not the primary goal of the deck. The primary goal of the deck is to control 2 sides, let's say. 1 is good, 2 are even better, because what happens then? You play trolls which have fears and they have 18 strength, and you are able to make a very hard time for your opponent to make double moves or even to survive if he doesn't destroy your setup. So generally the Overwhelm strategy focuses on buffing your minions up by some kind of strength support area card, or perhaps an event or even a minion's ability. Here the active bonus which you want to add to the minions is used by the Great Siege Towers. You play a minion, then you remove a token and you buff an orc. Or passively, from Troop Tower, and from tower walkway, either by controlling sites or by having some minions stacked on a site you already control. Very nice deck, I would say the prime of the movie format. Depends on the meta though. Your greatest enemy could be Stand Against Darkness, which easily gets rid of the troll which I had spoken about, and that removes some of that momentum of yours that you are trying to work towards. A word which I mentioned a while ago was setup. A thing that a lot of people are not aware of, or maybe they ignore it, or maybe nobody ever told them. Just like to me, when I started with this game, when I was trying to learn the game a little bit better, and that word was setup. It is very important to keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to play all the minions you have in your hand or all the cards you have in your hand when they arrive. Instead, what is better is to save them up for a double move so that you can play not just 2 of the 6 minions you have in hand, but perhaps all 6 of them, and that could be more difficult for your opponent to deal with. A great example of something like that working out could be versus archery. Let's say that you play Corsairs, your opponent has Greenleaf, and he has Aragorn with Aragorn's bow, and maybe he has some other ways how to wound your minions. Perhaps it could be Eowyn, which finishes off any minions who survive the first archery wounds. So you play nothing, your opponent wants to keep up with your free peoples, and you play what you would have played originally on the first move, but added by 4 other minions. And you will see that that is definitely going to be much more difficult for opponent. Companions are going to die, he's going to have many wounds on board, he's going to even lose some of his cards due to this, because he needs to develop some effort in order to deal with the situation. So the golden rule is you always want to play efficiently. That means you want to play the most important things so that you do what you want to do, such as you want to get rid of an annoying possession, and then just build your setup and wait for a better opportunity to kill your opponent. Don't just recklessly put everything on board, because then what is going to happen is that your opponent will kill it, destroy it, get rid of it somehow. He will survive, he will make a double move, as if he had stopped originally and went on after you have played your free peoples. So that is much better to approach it the way which I have just described. Let's take a look at already the more complicated methods how to kill your opponents. The next one is going to be Swarm. Swarm wins by one of the rules inbuilt in this game, which is if you have, for example, 3 companions on board and your opponent plays 4 minions, you are allowed to assign 3 minions, but you don't have any other companions or allies to cover for the rest of the minions, unless you have the keyword defender +1, +2, whatever. So your opponent then assigns the minion to whichever companion he prefers. That is bad for you, because he's probably going to kill your best companion, or maybe he's going to kill the weakest point, or even the worst case scenario, he's going to kill your ring bearer and the game is over. This is a valid shadow strategy, works out very well in many formats. In Fellowship it would be Moria. Now we are looking at Decipher's movies regroup orcs, whose primary function is to win by swarm. There's the secondary method to win by wounds, but that doesn't happen too often, because usually when you get to kill your opponent by wounds, that means that he's already suffering from the swarm you are putting up on him. So what you try to do is to play some free peoples, which draws a lot of cards, because swarm it only works if you have more minions than your opponent has companions or ways to deal with them. That means if you draw 4 orcs and your opponent has 5 companions, your orcs aren't going to do very well against your opponent's 3 peoples. That's why you always need to try, and like I said before, like I said a while ago, you need to wait once your attack is worth it and then attack at full strength. That is going to be much better for you and much more difficult for the opponent to deal with. There are some cards here which are apologies, which are purely situational, but you still need to play them, because now what I said, if your opponent has 5 companions and you have 4 minions, that's bad for you. What if he has 6 companions and you have 6 minions? That is still bad for you, because he assigns everything on board. For situations like these, cards like Enquea exist, which punish your opponent for trying to survive you easily. Now you play Enquea plus 5 or 6 other orcs. You kill one of the key companions, which would normally be very irritating for you to deal with. That is very bad for your opponent, so you have just punished his greed, and you probably even kill him on the same side because of it. That is something that I mentioned in one of the previous videos. You need to be on the lookout for cards like Enquea, which punish these situations. If you are too greedy, then your opponent will punish it, and you don't want that to happen. And you want to punish your opponent if he does that. That's something like a general rule for your decks. You want to be ready for situations which could cost you the game. Alright, that was the Swarm. Now, even harder to pull off would be the Corruption deck. Now what this works with is the Ringbearer's Resistance, especially efficient in movie. Unfortunately for you, a card like Sam exists, which has no 2-play spot. It's very easy, and the standard is that you play at least 1 Sam in your deck to deal with corruption. Now why is that? Because alternative Ringbearers were introduced in Reflections, which is an edition included in the movie format, and therefore you need to be on the lookout for any way to corrupt your Ringbearer. Sam gets rid of this danger almost too easily, I would say. It is probably necessary to have some protection against corruption, but he might be just too good at what he does. But as I said, the standard is people play 1 copy of him, and in the ideal situation you don't know what your opponent plays at the start of the game. That's why if you see Sam, which is a situational companion, you will probably mulligan because you want better cards which support your general idea, such as if you play Knights. You definitely prefer to play Aragorn and let's say let's say Garrison, then Sam, because Sam does nothing at the start of the game. He's only good when you are about to die, then he saves the situation for you. So that works for you to keep your shadow strategy a secret, and then you can slowly work towards corrupting your opponent. Now how to do that? You play cards that simply say any burden. There aren't many cards which say the resistance is smaller, but what you can do is that you can get rid of cards which make your opponent's resistance higher. A great example here is if your opponent plays Ring of Fury, which makes Gimli damage +2, which makes him resistance +2 due to his ability. Then, if you discard a ring, it's essentially something like adding 2 burdens. But be careful, he might play another one, so you want to do this as a sort of a killer move when he has only 2 resistance left. Then it is going to be great for you. Now, what cards add burdens, for example, it wants to be found, or during his mine, or the combination in this deck using Gorgoroth Stormer and Mordor Fighter combination in order to add burdens in Shadow phase. The typical thing for this deck is that you try to play in a different way than what is normal in this game. What I mean by that is, your opponent is ready for all sorts of wounds, he's ready for some overwhelm, some swarm, he's ready for, I don't know, basically keeping you in place to stop you and to win by 3 peoples. And he is definitely not going to be as ready for corruption. So generally it is a good idea to mix this deck in your pool of decks when you play tournaments, because it's a surprise factor. People don't usually have practiced enough against it. They are going to make mistakes, maybe even discard some on side 2 when they see, I don't know, Ground, which is a typical card for Besiegers. So that's the way to win with this deck. Now let's take a look at the next one. That is going to be a timing attack. Now what this deck looks like. You have some card that you want to win by, and the card usually is going to work just once per game for you. At a certain moment when you have reached some power spike or you have prepared enough to pull it off. One of the examples here is the Watcher Corruption timing attack. Now how this works is, let's say that your opponent has 9 companions on board, just for a simple case scenario. You play Gollum on side 8 as your first card, you play Plotting, and your opponent has 9 threats on board. What you do next is that you exert Gollum twice to play Watcher from discard pile. That discards Gollum, but because you have another fence on board, Watcher is going to stay. His ability discards all other minions at all times, so he is on board because you are at marsh thanks to the evil smelling fence, and you are able to use side 8 almost forever because you remove 2 threats, you add 2 burdens, Gollum gets discarded. You remove 2 threats, you add 2 burdens, Gollum gets discarded, and you do that over and over again. In order to add some Twilight, you add Twilight by Troubled Mountains, which exerts Watcher in Shadow phase, and at that point already adds, let's say, 4 or 5 Twilight tokens in that Shadow phase. Also, you might argue that you are not going to have enough threats and your opponent is not going to have enough companions on board, so you have to play Fat One Wants It, which always gives you 1 threat back when Gollum gets discarded. And you can play, or you have to play Captured by the Ring, which you can play even though Gollum is going to get discarded in that very Shadow phase. Now I'm not going to go more into detail with this deck, because I will focus on individual decks in the future. And this is just an example for you to see what a timing attack looks like. Most of the game you are going to do nothing, you will just create some sort of setup. Usually people will have no idea what you are up to, and then on one side you will kill your opponent. It is very frustrating to play against for your opponent. On the other hand, it's very efficient, it's a good tournament strategy, and it requires extreme practice in order to be pulled off well. One tiny mistake might cost you the game. So, we had Wounds, Timing Attack, Swarm, Stop Deck, Overwhelm, corruption, and the last thing that I'm going to mention is the alternative ways how to win. There are some cards which literally say you have won the game. Example would be the card Despair. That says that if the ring bearer has, let's say, 10 burdens and there are 2 companions in the pile, then you can spot an orc to corrupt the ring bearer. Now, what I said was intentional. The ring bearer has 10 burdens. Frodo, Resolute Hobbit, could survive that, but normally cards like these, if you are able to play them and win by them, you would have won the game anyway, so it is not even worth playing them. There are some funny ways how to make them work, but they are not too competitive. They are more like a meme strategy. You can definitely have some fun with those, but it is not going to bring much fun to your opponent, and it is going to be very difficult to get to the point of the condition written on the card. So I wanted to mention this as another way how to win by Shadow, but I do not recommend playing it too much, especially not in competitive play. That would be it from the Shadow strategies which I prepared for today and the tips around them, because I received a request for the next video. In the next video I'm going to speak about what counters what in the movie format, some ways how to deal with certain deck types and how to prepare for tournaments. That is what I'm going to talk about in the next video. Thank you for your attention.